Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled NAA's Inflation Tracker, Cutting Through the Noise. My name is James Campbell, and I'm the Senior Manager of Industry Relations with NAA. I want to welcome all of our members in attendance and thank you for joining us for this important topic. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping points. First, this presentation is being recorded and will be posted to our website and YouTube channel next week. You may then share this presentation with those colleagues and friends who are unable to attend at present. Next, we have a lot of time at the end of today's presentation for live questions and answers. You may type your questions into the Q&A or chat boxes on your screen, and we'll share them with our presenter. Now, I am pleased to introduce our presenter, Paula Munger. Paula is Assistant Vice President of Research and Analysis with NAA. She is responsible for leading research efforts on topics of importance to the industry. Paula gathers, analyzes, and synthesizes data and information to arrive at the most meaningful and relevant insights. Her research aids NAA members in their business initiatives, as well as NAA advocacy and public relations efforts. Paula's background includes positions at the Federal Reserve System, Cushman & Wakefield, and the University of New Orleans Real Estate Center. She is a member of the National Association for Business Economics and the Counselors of Real Estate. Paula?
Thanks so much, James, and thanks everyone for joining our presentation today. So it is called Cutting Through the Noise. So I'm going to start out by actually talking about the noise, and then going to tell you what I think is important to know about inflation. And then we're going to look at NAA's inflation tracker. This is a new product we just started in June. And finally, we'll end off with the apartment industry impacts, potential impacts from inflation. So let's first start with the noise. How complicated is inflation, first of all? One, it has multiple names. So I'm saying inflation now. Inflation is actually the change in a price index. We talk about the consumer price index all the time, but there are a lot of different measures of prices. So people call it different things. There's also several different measures. And we're going to talk about those as we get further on into the presentation. Then we have 1 month changes versus annual changes. And while those can seem obvious sometimes, you need to pay attention when you're looking at CPI data, at which particular point in time those data are being compared to. And then the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they are the ones who actually calculate CPI. They keep track of a sampling of goods and services, and they watch prices on those goods and services every month. But it's not that simple. So there's over 200 components in CPI. They get down to some excruciatingly detailed information. They have various weights and what they called relative importance. So there's a whole lot going on in the background of this important measure. The other thing is high inflation is bad. I mean, if our wages aren't keeping up, we're losing our purchasing power. So I don't think anyone would argue about that. Low inflation is actually just as bad, particularly when it's so low or even disinflationary. And what happens with that, interest rates will go hand in hand. We're going to talk about that relationship later with low inflation. And if inflation is so low, it does not enable the Fed to lower interest rates during a time of economic downturn, as we saw after the last recession. So we want to keep it really just at a balance, and that's what the Fed's job is, one of their jobs. And finally, it's a complicated issue because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you're sitting here today and you're pretty sure you want to make a large purchase. You think that price is going to go up, so you're going to go out and buy it now before the prices go up even more, which is brilliant. But there are a lot of other brilliant people out there, and guess what? They're going to do the same thing you're doing for that same product. So they are going to cause an increase in demand. And when you have an increase in demand, you have issues with supply that producers can't keep up with all the demand. And then you have price increases. So basically, it's sort of this vicious cycle that we're going to get into a lot more in this presentation. Why are the data noisy right now? First and foremost was the issue I just talked about, where you're looking at either a monthly change or a yearly change. Most of the time when you hear about inflation, you're hearing it as a year over year comparison to this price last year. And that's a problem for this summer. Last April, May, June, and even into July, we had some serious issues. We were shut down, businesses were closed, factories shut down. So prices fell. And when prices fell last year, you're dropping the base of the CPI such that any increases, especially now when we're having all this demand for goods and we're getting out there and the economy is reopening, you're comparing it to a super low level last year. So that's one. Now, those are going to start to ease within the coming months because that was particularly bad really last summer, maybe into July, but by August, that was pretty cleared up. We also have had an unprecedented global chain of events. And when you think about things like a natural disaster, they're very regional. You're still able to get goods and services from outside the region into your area. That wasn't the case with the pandemic because we were all going through the same thing at the same time. So factories all over the world were closing. There were shutdowns. There were really no consumer expenditures for a long time. The other issue is that reopening the economy is going to take some time. So while it happens in phases, it's still, and this relates to the next bullet point, it's still temporary. It's only going to reopen once. So that really leads us to believe that these price increases are temporary. So you didn't go on vacation last year, so you're going this year, but you're not going to continually go on vacation month after month. So basically, these are these one-time factors, and we're going to see the economy reopen just once. And then finally, the supply chain bottlenecks. And we really are in this cycle now. And I'm sure I don't need to tell any of you on the call about these issues, but there's the microchip shortage that has been well documented. But I saw something recently that even though cars get all the news, it affects something like 169 industries. So that's a big deal. And then not only do we have supply chain issues, and again, because we didn't turn on a switch and everything went back to normal, factories have to ramp up again. But in addition to supply chain issues, we're also having a lot of shipping issues. So just an overwhelming amount of demand, and it's very difficult for the providers of the goods and services to stay on top of the demand. But what do you really need to know? First, why are prices increasing? They are increasing. There's absolutely no doubt about that. The pent-up demand, I mentioned that earlier. So there were things we didn't do last year, things we didn't buy last year. All that is coming back as more and more people get vaccinated, more and more people are comfortable going out. Logistical issues, those are the things I just mentioned, supply, shipping, et cetera. Fiscal stimulus. So fiscal stimulus is what the government does with, these were the checks we all got, the expanded unemployment benefits. And the thing with fiscal stimulus, it's finite. So it is another temporary factor, which also leads us to believe the price increases are going to be temporary. We will see the effects of this wane fairly soon, probably within the next few months. Monetary policy, on the other hand, is not. It's more of an ongoing policy. And what we see the Fed doing, the Fed is in charge of that. They are purchasing treasuries and also keeping interest rates almost at zero. And that's just flooding the economy with money right now. And the other thing, and this is related to pent-up demand, we have money this year and we're going to spend it. And we see incomes are going up. This is not just wages and salaries, but again, with all the fiscal stimulus that's been put out there, people have higher incomes. We also see the savings rate. We saw the savings rate spike in April of 2020 at 34%. And to put that in context, it ranged between 6 and 8% a few years prior to that. Last reading in June, it was down to 9.4%. And what does that mean? Well, we're finally dipping into our savings. Maybe we're buying a house, maybe we're buying a car, but we have the money, we're going to spend it. And that again is flooding the market with all kinds of cash. I'm going to talk about a few price change measurements. The headline consumer price index, this is what gets talked about in the news all the time. So it's just one measure of prices. The core CPI sometimes gets mentioned, and what that is excludes volatile food and energy prices. So think about gas. I mean, I have a half a tank of gas. I'm not going on a big car trip. I don't like the prices. I'm just going to wait. Or I might, go across town where I know there's a cheaper gas station. But so those, as you know, and food as well, those prices do this basically all the time. So core CPI takes those prices out and gives a more clearer picture. However, because of this unprecedented time we're in, we're seeing other goods and services that are also having volatile prices right now. So even the core CPI isn't necessarily capturing all we need to know. The next measure you rarely see reported widely, maybe in some of the business or economic media outlets, but it's called the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index. This is a completely different measure. It's put out by a different agency. This is from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. It has different different goods and services, different weights, different components. And there's also a core PCE. That's the measure that's important to the Fed. The Fed has decided they like this measure better because it really measures the underlying inflation. When we talk about underlying inflation, it's what's probably going to be with us for longer than these temporary price increases. So that's what they follow. That's how they make their policy. And as you know, they target, they used to say it was a 2% target. Sometime last summer, they came out, it was a big deal, that they said now they want it to average 2%. So if you're going to have a 2% average, that means there's going to be times when it's below 2 and above 2, and it's well above 2 right now. But they're still saying they feel this is temporary. Most economists, analysts, I'm one of them, think it will be temporary, 6 months, maybe into 2022, but that's right around where people are talking about in terms of inflation. And then there's other very interesting measures like sticky price inflation. The Atlanta Fed puts this out, and it's basically prices that don't change all that much. And think about rent, think about public transportation costs, things like that. They separate out from the more volatile goods and services that are out there. Median CPI is published by the Cleveland Fed, and then a trimmed mean CPI covered by the Dallas Fed. And there's many other measures, but they all do one thing. They try to cut through this noise. Components. I talked about components and how they were over 200 in inflation. And one thing that's important to know when you read about it every month after inflation's release is what's causing it. And when you look at, this is based on the July release, so just 3 components that only make up 11% of the CPI were responsible for most of the increase in prices. And those are lodging away from home. So again, that's this pent-up demand. We're going out, we're going to hotels, we're booking vacation rentals, car and truck rentals, and used cars and trucks. And the car and truck rentals are, as you know, they're, typically have new cars. That's not happening because of the chip shortage. So they've had to dip into the used car and truck market, and so have consumers. So we're all basically fighting for the same goods. But those 3 components had 20% or more inflation. One of them was 40-something percent. The remaining 89% of core CPI only had inflation averaging 3%. So now we're going to talk about NAA's inflation tracker. As I mentioned, it's a new product. We just released the first one in June, and we now have July and August out there. And why are we tracking it? One, because prices impact more than just tangible goods. They impact wages, they impact interest rates. Some people would say interest rates and cap rates go hand in hand. I don't believe that, especially after what we saw in the last cycle. We saw the Fed raising interest rates, and not much was moving with cap rates. But also importantly, consumer and business sentiment. So if you think we're going to go through an inflationary time, you're going to be strapped for cash, you're not feeling very good. And when consumers and businesses start having negative sentiment or having concern or uncertainty, that's when we can see the economy take a tumble. So it's really important to keep track of inflation. And then just noisy data can lead to bad decision making. So we want to make sure we know what we're looking at. And we're looking at what we really should be looking at based on our functions in our organizations. And our members requested it. Our members were hearing about it a lot and said, look, what can you guys do on this? What can you tell us? What do we need to know? So that's why we started it. And as I said, it's released once a month. We do release it on the day CPI is released, typically later in the day. It's 5 simple charts. I'm going to show some of them coming up with an analysis, including breaking down components, including looking at alternative measures. We also tell you what to keep an eye on over the next month. The latest release was just last week, and those are the charts we'll be looking at. And the next release will be coming out on September 14th. So one of the things I was mentioning the core PCE and how different it is. And this is what I have graphed here, so you can really see the difference. And the headline CPI is that blue line, and the core PCE, again, this is what the Fed's following on how they're going to make their interest rates and bond purchase decisions. And that's the red line. So, and that's still pretty high. That's at 3.1%. It's the highest it's been, 3.5 rather. The highest it's been though in 30 years. So it's not that it's not worth noting, it is, but when you compare it to, it's a full 200 basis points less than what the headline CPI was going forward. So we are certainly in a time of high inflation. I don't need to tell anyone that, but we're also looking at all these different measures that are also raising some red flags for us. And this is wages compared to another measure. So the blue line are wages, and wages and inflation go hand in hand as well. Things start costing more. Workers demand higher wages. So we are looking at the blue line. We see a spike of 6.6% in April. What that is basically all the lower income workers that were out of a job, leaving just the remotes, work from homes, typically higher income. Those are people that were left in the job pool. And that's why that happened with wages. And you see that coming down pretty precipitously to where it is now. There's just a 1.9% growth in the second quarter for wages. Those are all those lower income workers going back into the workforce. The ECI, Employment Cost Index, is also put out by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but it's a different measure. And what it does is it takes into account the occupation of a person and the industry. So it's going to avoid swings like April of 2020, because it's taking into account that, oh, these are the lower wage workers that lost their jobs. So we smooth out that data. It also measures the cost of benefits to employers, which, as you know, is substantial. So there's wages and salaries, but when you put benefits into the mix, so that's why this is considered a better measure than wage growth. By the way, wage growth, you'll hear call average hourly earnings. That's released the same day as the employment report. So depending on what the jobs market is doing, sometimes we don't even hear much about wage growth. But as you can see, it's still pretty high. It was 3.1%. On the last release right here, but it's not that far off from where it was in 2018 and 19. So this is, the Fed is also looking at wages as well as the employment market. And why should we even look at employment when we're talking about inflation? It's because it's the Fed's dual mandate. They are intertwined. The Fed needs to keep low inflation, but remember, not too low, and low unemployment. And this is a chart going back to 1960. I level data series. There's really not much going on here, but you see the unemployment rate in red and this core PCE I keep talking about in blue. And it used to be that this, if for any total geeks out there, this was known as the Phillips curve. It was developed by an economist way back when, with the premise that when you had high unemployment, you had low inflation. And for a large part of, for decades, that pretty much held up. And you could see it really just falls apart. You have, in fact, since 2000, this core PCE is averaging 1.7%, while you're having huge swings in unemployment. But despite the fact that the relationship is iffy at best, and some have even said, just don't even look at this anymore, the Fed still does. They're looking at this right here. This is the unemployment rate. There's still a lot of people unemployed, and they are going to watch that. And if it gets to this, then you can expect them to take some action, and it's likely going to be with an interest rate increase. But they do look at the unemployment rate super closely. These are some of the other measures I mentioned earlier. There's kind of a lot going on in this chart, but it's nicely color-coded. So you can see that even these measures that are stripping out volatility are pretty high. So most of them are in the red. So that's above a target. And this is not the 2% target. This is the target for that particular measure that actually translates into the Fed's 2% target. But the Atlanta Fed puts this out every month, and you're able to track it. Maybe you find yourself liking a particular measure because it makes more sense to what you're doing. But we still have a few measures that are in the green. And now we're going to talk about inflation in apartments. And the first thing we're going to mention, this is yet another measure of prices. This is the producer price index. So it measures the products that you need to produce a good and service. And I have construction up here. We've heard a lot about construction costs, but I like using this chart because it's actually pretty mind-boggling. The BLS actually aggregates all the construction inputs, anything possible that you need for a project, except for, it does not include labor. So that's huge because we know that labor costs are going up too. It does not include capital investment. It does not include imports. And I have single and multifamily on here, even though they track obviously very closely. Multifamily has experienced 6 months of consecutive double-digit increases. This is year over year. So remember, we need to think about last year because we see prices fell during that time. And then single family construction, but there was around 5 months. Last month, it was almost a 40% increase, and almost 30%. What's astounding about that is that included the lumber. We keep hearing about lumber. Everyone knows everything there is about lumber prices, I think, but they fell. Those prices fell, and they weren't enough to bring down these increases because we still have increases in concrete and steel and gypsum products, et cetera. So we're going to be feeling, the construction industry is going to be feeling some pain for a while. And then we're looking at things that are important to apartments. You know, when you have turn, what are you looking at? Home electronics, furniture costs. So I have some, I think there's about 9 categories I pulled out again from the CPI. The blue bar is year-over-year increases, and that's on the left axis. And the red diamonds are monthly. I wanted to look at what the monthly increases are doing to see if that inflation is accelerating recently. So those are average monthly increases. And you can see televisions, furniture and bedding, sporting goods, that would include things like treadmills, bikes. Bikes are really challenging right now. Those have increased by 5% or more over the past year, and they are increasing on a monthly basis. So that we do see some prices pulling back. Look at windows and floor coverings. Housekeeping supplies, not a surprise because those were very costly last year at this time. So those are starting to settle down. And this is the ECI again, but I wanted to look at as close as I could get to the multifamily industry, which we can't do with the Bureau of Labor Statistics because they have a broader real estate category. So this includes all property types. This would be workers in the office sector, workers in the retail sector, et cetera. And also rental and leasing. So there actually would be car rentals in here. But still, I wanted to just point out that when we're looking at the ECI, the employment, this is the cost of employment, including those benefits. Right now, running below average for all industries, which is in the red line. And I wanted to put accommodations and food service in here because we know they're having a hard time finding workers. And you can see the trends above, even before the pandemic has really accelerated that. So as those restaurants are trying to get workers back, they're having to do things like offer incentives and just offer higher pay in general. This is shifting gears, so less about economic data and more on apartment data, but we hear about commercial real estate being an inflation hedge, and really apartments are at the top of that list because of the shorter term lease. So if your costs as an owner operator are going up, you are going to be able to increase your rent to cover those costs. And that's really not the case with some other property types like industrial office. You have 5, 7, 10-year leases. And this really shows, this is actually the volume of transactions. So these are investors purchasing property over the first half of the year, and this is how they spent it. So 92.1 billion on apartments. It's around 37% of all the investment out there for commercial property. So I think it's really just a testament of not necessarily only the inflation hedge, but just the long-term confidence in this asset class. And we also see foreign capital coming into the market a lot, especially at the end of last year and into 2021. And it used to be that we would just see that in the gateway markets, but we're seeing more and more investment in general, both domestic and foreign, in smaller metro areas and in suburban markets. So right now we had a decline in transactions like all properties did last year, but we're really on a roll, and the investment market is looking really strong for apartments. And I have here when interest rates rise, not if, but there's a few things we're looking at here just to sort of see the relationship. So this is the federal funds rate. You can tell because it's almost zero. This is the actual rate that the Fed set. And when the Fed increases these rates, you often see all the other interest rates increase with it. This is the core PCE we've talked about a couple of times that is getting up there. And this is a 10-year treasury. It's a pretty standard interest rate. We did see that along with mortgage rates rising at the end of the year. They've started to settle back down. But this right here, the core PCE, at its current rate, it would take 6 months for it to get to that Fed 2% target. And even though the Fed doesn't really, it's very vague. It says things like for some time. So it's a long term, it's 5 years that it would take it to get to a 2% average. A 5-year average. That takes 6 more months. So when the Fed is sort of waiting it out, I think they're waiting to see how long this is going to stay this high. But in terms of interest rates, we're going to, it means construction loans and mortgage loans are more expensive, obviously. Any sort of financing that you might have for capital expenditures runs the risk of being more costly. On the flip side of that, though, you have home mortgage loans that are also going up, and that's where you get potentially some first-time home buyers that may stay in the rental market a little longer. So there's certainly good and bad things about interest rates rising, but the Fed is keeping a close eye on that. And once we, especially if unemployment goes down further and we start having a healthier labor market, most people don't expect them to raise interest rates until next year. But some are saying it wouldn't be surprising if it was at the end of this year. And what's ahead, finally, just looking at what things we can look at to sort of gauge where we are. This is another old data series. This goes back to the 70s, and it's just one measure of inflation expectations. And inflation expectations, remember I talked about the self-fulfilling prophecy. This is one of those things. So this is really, the blue line is the one survey of consumers. There are many. The University of Michigan comes out every month, consumer sentiment survey. This is what consumers, average consumers, think the inflation rate is going to be within the near term. And then what's on here is the headline CPI, because that's what they asked them about, in the red line. It tracks pretty closely, except when you get here. So this is when a lot of these relationships start just not working, because the Fed has come under its target for so long that consumers were expecting higher inflation over the past 2 decades. So right here, we kind of catch up. And here is, they are really in line with what the inflation is right now. There was just a new measure released, a different measure yesterday that says consumers are expecting 4.8% inflation this year, settling down to 3.5%, 3.7% over the next 3 years. And businesses look at this. So if you are pricing, you as a consumer are pricing in a 4.8% increase for the next year, producers will at some point raise their prices by that amount because they know that's something that they're going to be able to get for their product. And finally, just ending with some forecasts. These are just a few. The Federal Reserve Bank, of course, so they don't even forecast the CPI. They just look at their personal consumption expenditures. Moody's Analytics, the mortgage bankers of Fannie Mae and ING, financial services firm, and you can see that really probably ending 2021 somewhere between 4% and 5% for the headline CPI, and then falling. Within not a terrible, pretty close to certainly higher than 2020, but not what we're seeing this year. And then again, by 2023, so this is in less than 2 years, seeing it back around where we've been seeing it, which is around 2%. And similarly, a couple of firms outside of the Fed will forecast this CPE, and you can see a few of those forecasts here. Pretty high this year. That's going to take a lot for it to stay at that average. So Fannie Mae is expecting some more inflationary pressures, maybe higher than the others. And then by the time it gets back to 2023, really averaging where the Fed wants it to average. And again, over the longer term, it does not define what the longer term is, but certainly keeping an eye on those measures, as well as wage costs, as well as the labor market, because it's super important to what the Fed is planning in its policy. Any questions?
Terrific, Paula. Very helpful, very insightful. If you've got any questions for Paula, just simply type them into the Q&A box or the chat boxes at the bottom of your screen.
We will give it a minute.
You know, if any of the questions are kind of need some time to percolate a little bit, you can go to our website under staff, and Paula's email is there. I'm sure she'd welcome any individual question you might have.
Absolutely. Feel free to reach out anytime. And James, you want to cover our sort of our last minute?
Sure. Well, we've got one question at least. Anonymous attendee asks, do you personally expect that inflation will continue to rise?
I would say for the short term, yes. And this is my view, not necessarily that of NAAs. That's what the Fed always says. Yeah, I think there's no, when you look at those microchip issues, those are going to be with us for a while. I do think that, and how many industries they impacted. I do think that certainly, we saw airfares decline last month, which is huge because they've been going up because there's been so much demand. We're seeing more people go through TSA checkpoints. So I think when you weight those, for the rest of the year, we'll be seeing the headline, that we are experiencing high inflation. I do want to mention though that the latest release, which was July, and this is actually in the tracker, was the smallest monthly increase in the core PCE in 5 months. So we can't, 1 month doesn't make a trend, but it's already heading in the right direction where it may not be elevated for as long as we originally thought. But I don't know anyone that's not saying 6 months at the minimum.
Okay. Same questioner has a second question. Paula, if our government spends another $4.5 trillion, do you anticipate that it will provide upward pressure on inflation?
So this is a whole different package. We're talking about infrastructure spending. And right now, and I know there are other other soft infrastructure, they're calling it, other things out there that we don't know this. We know that the infrastructure is going to get passed, and that's going to get passed pretty soon. And that's government money. So that's the government spending that money on infrastructure. So we're not going to see that impact prices like we did when they're putting it really in the hands of consumers.
Okay. Same questioner has a third question. I read that housing costs make up to 1/3 of CPI. With exploding home prices and rent increases, Do you foresee these recent increases ramping up the headline CPI/PCE? The big increases in housing costs really haven't made it into the data yet.
You are correct. They have not. And in fact, in July, we saw shelter, what they call shelter, and it's actually the owner's equivalent of rent and rent of your primary residence. The owner's equivalent of rent was elevated somewhat, but in line with past pre-pandemic. Rent was still below pre-pandemic, and we know that's not true based on the statistics that we're seeing from all the data providers. So I think with the BLS, and we know there are issues, they're kind of antiquated with the actual what they're tracking in rents. And we also know that what we're seeing in the news, record-breaking growth, those are all pretty much a large professionally managed and maintained buildings. So we won't necessarily see that in the CPI data just yet. But I do know as of July, it's not responsible for a large increase at all.
Oh, we've got another question, Paula. Donald Davidoff asks, could you speak to how much rent increase versus how much is, quote, imputed rent, unquote, on owners? And exactly how do they calculate the imputed part for owners?
You're talking about, I guess he's talking about the CPI. So the owner's equivalent of rent, what it's supposed to be is what you would be able to rent your home out for. What it ends up being impacted by let's see, let me think about this. When you're looking, so interest rates, mortgage rates, it ends up being impacted by what you're paying for your mortgage. So refinancing activity is going to impact that owner's equivalent of rent, which is why it's far from a perfect measure of housing prices.
Terrific. Any more questions? Feel free to type away. Happy to answer. And again, if you come to a question after this webinar is over, you're always welcome to email Paula directly. Well, I think we might be at the end of our question period. So again, thank you, Paula, great answers, and thanks for our viewers for great answers too. So in terms of additional resources, I want to let you know that NAA maintains an online portal for its many offerings in research and analysis. The URL is featured below. You are most welcome to scroll down and view the various research reports, publications, and special projects featured within. Next slide, please. Moreover, if you've enjoyed this webinar and would like to view more, you can visit our website for those webinars upcoming, as well as those that passed and that are now viewable on demand. So again, I want to thank everyone for participating. We value your membership, we welcome your attendance, and thank you all for participating. Thanks as well to our speaker, Paula. Terrific. All the best.
Thanks, everyone, and please feel free to reach out. I never get tired of talking about economics.
Excellent. All right, thank you all. Take care.